change. Hello, Mr. Ralph.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you well. Can you hear me as well?
Yes, we do now. We hope you're well.
I'm very well. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I am just starting to share my screen.
Yes, we see that at the moment. We're all very excited to have you here. You have a shining audience, and the screen is yours now.
Wonderful. 1 second again. Now, hopefully, we're going to have this in the right place in a moment. And can you confirm that you now see everything according to plan? It looks like it. I can see, yes, the audience. So thank you again for having me today. I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you at this wonderful event in Istanbul. But so I'm giving my presentation from our main office in Brussels, and I would like us to go together through a reality check. What does it actually mean for the buildings and construction sector to address climate change and play a positive role in addressing climate change? I don't think I need to remind us too much about the impacts of the changing climate, which we are already seeing today. This graph and the map is from a very recent report from the World Meteorological Organization, which is looking at the state of the climate in Europe. And what it finds is that the temperatures across Europe are growing much faster, are increasing much faster than in the rest of the world. And if we zoom into Turkey, we see that the color shading for Turkey is even darker red than, for example, in the middle of Europe. So Turkey is experiencing more extreme events. It's experiencing higher average temperatures every year. And that is, of course, one of the concerns. And that is why it's so important that we also take action on adaptation, as the speaker just before me highlighted so clearly. These increasing temperatures, of course, have direct impacts. And this is another chart which I wanted to share with you from this very same report. This is just looking at the wildfires and the impact of wildfires in the different European countries. And it also gives that information for Turkey, which I've highlighted here. Turkey had over 200,000 hectares burned only in 2021. This is the highest burned area of all the European countries. Now, of course, Turkey has one of the largest areas, and therefore that value is high compared to smaller countries, but it should really be a big reason for concern because it has an enormous impact. But I don't want to talk about the impacts only. I also want to highlight what the sector is actually doing. Only a few weeks ago, the so-called Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction released its annual status report. And this annual status report contains an index, the so-called Global Buildings Climate Tracker, which tries to describe whether the buildings and construction sector is on track to meet the Paris Agreement. It asks the question, is the sector on track with the Paris pathway? And the Paris pathway is here described as this dashed line at a 45-degree angle, which you see here. It started measuring in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was signed. And the solid line, the solid blue line below it with the values, is the index, which is measuring to what degree the buildings and construction sector is actually on track, is aligned with this full decarbonization pathway to meet Paris. And if the two lines, if the dashed line and the solid line would meet completely, then the sector would be on track. But what we are observing is that the performance, the decarbonization performance of the sector is in fact much below the line. And if we look at the value for 2021, we see a value of 8.1, while the sector should actually be well above 16. And the resulting gap of 9 points here, described with this green figure here, is the gap which the sector is showing in making efforts to really decarbonize aligned with the Paris Agreement. And so this index has been tracking the development over the years since 2015, as I said. It showed some improvement, but what it also shows is that this gap, this distance of where we should be and where we are, is growing over the years. So for example, in 2019, it was a gap of 6.6. In 2020, we saw a much better development. The value was 11.3. But we suspected already back then that this is due to the global corona pandemic and the global shutdown, the global lockdown, which we saw. And in fact, the value for 2021, where we arrived at 8.1, confirmed that 2020 was a special year, a pandemic outlier. So that is a real issue for concern for anybody who is interested in mitigating climate change. Now let's have a look at really the global impact of the sector. Again, this is taken from this global status report of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. And what it shows is that the construction sector, the buildings and construction sector, causes 37% of the global CO2 emissions. Now, this 37% is, of course, composed of different emission sources, which you can see here on the right side of this pie chart. We have direct and indirect emissions coming from residential buildings. We have direct and indirect emissions coming from non-residential buildings. And then a significant share is caused by the emissions or by the processes and production processes to produce building materials such as concrete, aluminum, steel, or bricks and glasses, which you also find here. So that the total impact is 37%. And the chart on the left side, the bar chart here on the left side, shows you how the emissions have been growing over time. And I have to say, we're now unfortunately at an all-time high of global CO2 emissions for which the buildings and construction sector is responsible. But that doesn't mean that nothing is happening. The Global Alliance has also launched a so-called roadmap process, a roadmap for buildings and construction. And as you can see on this map, Turkey is actually participating in this roadmap process, together with many other countries from around the world. And what this roadmap process actually does is to define a clear stepwise methodology, a clear process to decarbonize the buildings and construction sector. And it gives guidance on all these topics, what to do. And this roadmap process is defined, and you can find this in guidance reports, which are available on the website of the Global ABC. You can also find experience reports. You can find roadmaps from other countries there. The point is that the best way to address decarbonization in buildings and construction is to follow a clearly defined pathway, so that it is not confusing, that it's not too challenging for everybody involved. And when we look at some of the examples which some of the participating countries are showing, I'm just listing here 3 very different countries from Europe, from Southeast Asia, from South America, just to give you a little bit of a global perspective. All these roadmaps then are leading to countries setting clear goals where they want to be, whether it's in 2025, as in Denmark, or whether it's in 2050, as with Indonesia, or whether it's about 2030 targets and 2050 targets, as in the case of Colombia. The point is that these targets have been set and defined in the roadmap process, and the roadmap clearly shows how these targets can be achieved. But of course, we also heard earlier that Turkey has set targets, that Turkey has ambition a very high ambition level to reduce its emissions from buildings and construction, of course, we need to make sure that these targets are being met. And to illustrate how this can be done and how it is done in the European Union, I want to give you a quick snapshot of what's happening in the EU at this very moment. As you may know, the EU has committed to reduce its emissions by at least 55% by 2030. And in fact, for the building sector, this means a 60% reduction target by 2030, as it's described in the supporting documents of the European legislation. The EU also has agreed to become fully climate neutral by 2050, and that of course means that the building stock has to be climate neutral as well. And again, in return, this means that buildings must be net zero carbon throughout their life cycle. I will come to what this means in a moment. Now, these goals are enshrined, are confirmed in regulation, in European regulation. For example, we have the European Climate Law, which clearly defines the goal for 2030 and for 2050. And when it comes to buildings and construction, we have the so-called Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which is a European law, which describes and defines the energy performance of buildings and defines zero emission objectives. And this Energy Performance of Buildings Directive is currently under revision. It's currently being updated and changed. And we expect this process to be concluded by the middle of next year, so the middle of 2023. And then we will have a new law which all the member states in the EU will have to comply with, and they will have to transpose this into national law and national regulation. So what does net zero carbon actually really mean? It means that we're not only addressing the operational carbon and ignore the carbon emissions which are emitted during the production processes of building materials or during the construction process at the construction site itself. It means that we're looking at the whole life carbon cycle, and that we really also address that. Now, of course, this is not necessarily something which is easy to do, and I know that this topic was already discussed earlier today, so I don't want to go into details. What I would like to highlight, though, is that the European Union is committing itself in legislation to address this, to monitor this, to limit this over time, and to really regulate the buildings and construction sector to address its net zero whole life carbon target and develop strategies to meet that target. And one of the initiatives the EU is taking to really support that is the so-called EU Mission for Climate Neutral and Smart Cities. What does this mean? It means that the EU has defined 100 cities around the EU which will become climate neutral and smart by 2030. And these 100 cities are then supposed to serve as a lighthouse, as a leading example for all the other cities. They are implementing experiments, they are implementing innovation hubs, and these examples should then be followed by all the other European cities, so that all European cities are truly climate neutral by 2050. This is a bottom-up initiative where mayors in cities, the governments in cities, the citizens in cities are participating in this initiative, are taking a bottom-up approach to find the right solutions which work in the cities. Another example I would like to share with you is the so-called eSafe project. And I've chosen this project because you are all aware that Turkey is a country where the seismic danger, the seismic activities are of course very, very high. And that of course means that buildings need to be upgraded to be resilient against earthquakes, to withstand the impacts of earthquakes. And of course, when these seismic upgrades are being considered, it makes perfect sense to consider energy efficiency upgrades at the same time and to integrate the two solutions. And this is exactly what the eSafe project is doing with real-life projects and with virtual projects. to develop solutions, technological solutions, and to develop pathways, how the energy efficiency upgrades can be integrated with seismic upgrades, so that there is one intervention, there is one investment plan, which makes sense. The website of this project has many more informations and details and reports. I can't go into all the details, but I wanted to draw your attention to this very important project because it addresses two problems at the same time. So in order to conclude, I would like to just really reconfirm that statement that we need to have a comprehensive effort to decarbonize buildings and construction. We know the sector is fragmented. There are a lot of small companies participating in the sector, but we have to just be aware that climate change is real. It's here to stay. It's not going to go away if we ignore it. And so we really need to make an effort to manage and mitigate it and adapt to it. And that requires, of course, action from all sectors, including the buildings and construction sector. One of the best models to really do that is to engage in such a roadmap process, as I described it earlier, and to make also sure that it's in fact being implemented, that it does not only remain on paper, but that real action is taken. And that action requires that we have coalitions, that people, actors, companies in the buildings and construction sectors create coalitions with their peers and even with the competitors to plan and implement the actions, because it is not possible for one single actor to address the problems alone. And that also means that the workforce needs to have the right skills, and that it is necessary to invest in upgrading these skills. And these skills upgrades will then lead to increased innovation in the sector. And it will be necessary also that we support startups in buildings and construction to potentially develop new technologies, to develop new business models, whatever it takes to really trigger the change. Of course, all this should be supported by a regulatory framework, which is effective to support the transformation of the buildings and construction sector. We need clear targets, we need clear guidelines coming from policymakers, and they should support that transformation. And once this is all done, then of course, we need to make sure that we monitor and report the progress to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Because only if we monitor and report the progress, we can take the necessary adjustment steps to achieve the targets which we have agreed to. And I would like to really end my presentation with that slide, which again shows all the different actors in the construction and building ecosystem, the community. And really, it shows that we need everybody on board to address that challenge. But I know from the many positive examples we have from around the world, from around Europe, and also the many positive examples we have in Turkey, that it is possible, but we need to accelerate the change to really meet the climate change challenge and to avoid even more dangerous climate change. And with that, I would like to close my presentation and thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for being with us today. It was a very detailed presentation, both talking about the whole world as a system as a whole, and Turkey, specialized in Turkey. Thank you very much for all this very detailed information.
Thank you very much and good luck for the rest of your event.
Goodbye. Thank you.